5 life lessons from Alan Watts. What if I told you that everything you think you know about life, your struggles, your worries, your ambitions, is nothing more than a game? And what if I told you that the only reason you're suffering is because you forgot that it's a game? Alan Watts, one of the most profound philosophical minds of the 20th century, dedicated his life to unveiling the illusions that hold us back, and today, we're going to dive deep into 5 of his most powerful lessons that, if truly understood, have the power to completely change the way you see reality. But before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever felt trapped by your own mind? Have you ever spent hours or even years chasing something, only to realize that the chase itself was making you miserable? If so, then listen closely, because what you're about to hear might just be the key to unlocking a completely new way of living. One of the most striking ideas Watts explored is the paradox of control. You see, most of us live under the illusion that we can or should have control over everything: our careers, our relationships, our future. We believe that if we just plan everything perfectly, if we just make the right moves, we can force life to give us what we want. But have you ever noticed that the harder you try to control something, the more it seems to slip through your fingers? Consider the way you fall asleep. The more you try to force yourself to sleep, the more awake you feel. Or think about love. The more desperately you try to make someone love you, the more distant they become. Watts argued that this is because life is fundamentally spontaneous. It flows like a river, and the more you try to grasp it, the more it evades you. This doesn't mean you should be passive, far from it. But it does mean that true power comes not from control, but from alignment. Instead of forcing life to bend to your will, what if you learn to ride the waves of existence, moving with life rather than against it?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
This brings us to the second lesson, one that might be uncomfortable to hear. Are you ready? Here it is: you are not who you think you are. You see, we all carry around this idea of a self, a solid, unchanging identity that defines who we are. We say things like, "I'm this kind of person," or "that's just the way I am," as if our identity is something fixed in stone. But Watts challenges this notion. You are under no obligation, he says, to be the person you were 5 minutes ago. Think about that for a second. If you are not your past, if you are not your thoughts, then who are you? Watts suggests that the self we cling to is just a mental construct, a story we tell ourselves. In reality, we are more like a dance, constantly changing, evolving, and flowing with the world around us. Have you ever had a moment where you completely lost yourself in music, in nature, in laughter? That moment, Watts would argue, was closer to your true nature than any label or identity you've ever assigned to yourself. But here's where things get even deeper. If you are not a fixed self, if life is not something to be controlled, then what does that mean for your problems? What does that mean for your fears? Imagine for a moment that every problem in your life, every struggle, every anxiety you have, what if all of it exists not because reality is against you, but because you are resisting reality? Watts often used the analogy of water. If you try to punch water, it doesn't resist. It simply moves around your fist. If you fall into a river and struggle, you sink. But if you relax, the water holds you up. What if life works the same way? What if suffering isn't something that happens to you, but rather something you create by resisting what is? Now, let's pause for a moment. I want you to think about something. What is the one thing in your life right now that is causing you the most stress? Maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's money, maybe it's uncertainty about the future. Now ask yourself, are you fighting against reality, or are you flowing with it? What would happen if, just for a moment, you let go of the need to control it? What would happen if, instead of trying to force life to be a certain way, you simply allowed it to unfold? The truth is, we spend so much time worrying about the future that we forget to live. And that brings us to the next lesson, one that might be the most important of all. But before we get to that, I want you to take a deep breath. Let go of any tension you're holding in your body, because in the next part, we're going to explore something that could completely change the way you experience every moment of your life. The illusion of time and the art of being fully alive. Have you ever noticed how much of your life is spent somewhere other than here? Your body is in one place, but your mind is elsewhere, replaying the past, worrying about the future, lost in thoughts of what could have been or what might be. Alan Watts believed that this was one of the greatest illusions trapping humanity, the illusion of time. He argued that we are constantly chasing a future that never arrives, believing that happiness, fulfillment, or peace exist just around the corner after we get the right job, after we find the right partner, after we fix all of our problems. But what if I told you that the future you are waiting for will never come? Not because good things won't happen, but because when they do, they will arrive as the present moment. And if you have not learned to be present now, you will not be present then. You will simply continue chasing the next thing, trapped in an endless cycle of not yet. Watts often used the analogy of music to describe life. Imagine listening to a song. What makes it beautiful? It's not just the final note. If music were only about getting to the end, composers would just write one loud chord and be done with it. But no, the beauty of music is in the unfolding, in the way each note arises and disappears, leading seamlessly into the next. Life, he argued, is no different. It is not a journey with a destination, it is a dance. And the tragedy is that most people spend their entire lives trying to get somewhere, never realizing that they were supposed to be dancing all along. Think about your own life for a moment. How often have you told yourself, I'll be happy when I have more money, when I lose weight, when I achieve my goals? But have you ever noticed that when you do get what you want, the satisfaction is fleeting? That after the initial excitement fades, your mind simply latches onto the next thing to chase. Watts reminds us that this cycle never ends until we wake up to the fact that there is nowhere to get to. But that life is happening now, and if we are not fully present for it, we miss it entirely. This raises an uncomfortable but crucial question: how much of your life have you already missed? How many meals have you eaten without actually tasting them? How many conversations have you had without really listening? How many beautiful moments have passed by unnoticed because your mind was somewhere else? And perhaps most importantly, how much more of your life are you willing to let slip away before you realize that this moment, right here, is all there ever is? But here's the paradox. The moment you try to force yourself to be present, you are already lost. Because presence is not something you achieve, it is something you allow. Watts often spoke of the difference between effort and effortless awareness. Imagine holding water in your hands. If you squeeze too tightly, it slips through your fingers. But if you hold it gently, it remains. Presence works the same way. The more you try to force yourself into the moment, the more elusive it becomes. But when you simply relax and allow yourself to be here, Now, without judgment, without resistance, you begin to experience life as it actually is, and rather than how your mind thinks it should be. Now, take a deep breath. Feel the air entering your lungs. Notice the sensations in your body. Listen to the sounds around you. For just a moment, drop all thoughts of past and future and just be here. This is what Watts called the art of being fully alive. And the more you practice it, the more you begin to see that life is not something that is happening to you, it is something that is flowing through you. It is something you are. But if the present moment is all there is, then what does that mean for our dreams, our ambitions, our drive to improve our lives? Should we simply abandon all goals and desires? Watts would say no. He was not advocating for passivity, but for an entirely different way of engaging with life, one that is rooted not in striving, but in play. You see, we have been conditioned to believe that life is a struggle, that success requires constant effort, and that we must always be pushing ourselves towards something greater. But what if the most successful, most fulfilled people are not the ones who struggle the hardest, but the ones who have learned to play with life? What if the secret to achieving more is not to try harder, but to let go of the need to achieve at all? This is where things get really interesting. Because the moment you stop chasing happiness, fulfillment, or success, you begin to experience them naturally. When you are no longer trying to control life, you become open to its flow. When you stop worrying about the future, you become fully present for the opportunities that are right in front of you. And when you let go of the need to be someone, you discover an effortless joy in simply being. So, let's pause for a moment. I want you to reflect on something. What is one thing in your life that you have been chasing? And what would happen if, just for today, you stopped running after it and instead fully embraced where you are right now? How would your experience of life change if you approached it not as a problem to be solved, but as a dance to be enjoyed? Now, in the next part, we're going to explore something that challenges one of the deepest fears we all have, the fear of uncertainty. Because if life is a game, if it is a dance, then why does it sometimes feel so chaotic? Why do we struggle? Why do things fall apart? And most importantly, how do we learn to trust the unknown? Embracing the unknown, how to find freedom in uncertainty. What if the very thing you fear the most, uncertainty, is actually the gateway to true freedom? Alan Watts often spoke about the human tendency to seek security, to build walls around ourselves in an attempt to control the future. We want to know what's coming next. We want guarantees. We want life to be predictable so that we can feel safe. But here's the paradox. The more we try to control life, the more anxious we become. The harder we grip onto certainty, the more fragile we feel. And yet, life itself is inherently uncertain. Everything is constantly changing: your body, your thoughts, your relationships, the world around you. Nothing stays the same. And if we resist this truth, if we try to force life into a rigid structure, we only create suffering for ourselves. Watts often used the metaphor of swimming to illustrate this point. Imagine being caught in a river. If you panic and try to fight the current, you exhaust yourself. You struggle, you flail, and you sink. But if you relax, if you trust the water to carry you, you float. Life works the same way. The more you resist uncertainty, the more painful it becomes. But the moment you surrender, the moment you stop needing to know what's next, something incredible happens. You become free. Free from the constant need to control. Free from the anxiety of the unknown. Free to actually experience life as it is, rather than how you think it should be. But surrendering to uncertainty doesn't mean giving up. It doesn't mean becoming passive or letting life push you around. In fact, it's the opposite. It means stepping fully into the present moment and engaging with life completely, without the illusion of control. It means trusting that even though you can't see the whole path ahead, you can take the next step, and then the next, and the next. Have you ever noticed that the most exciting moments in life are the ones where you don't know what's coming? Falling in love, traveling to a new place, starting something new. These moments are thrilling precisely because they are uncertain, because they are alive with possibility. What if, instead of fearing uncertainty, we learn to embrace it? What if we saw it not as something to be avoided, but as something to be danced with? But this is where the idea of play comes in. Watts believe that life is not a problem to be solved, but a game to be played. And games, by their nature, are unpredictable. That's what makes them fun. Imagine playing a video game where you already knew every obstacle, every challenge, every outcome. It would be boring. The excitement comes from not knowing, from figuring things out as you go, from adapting, from experimenting, from playing. What if we approached life the same way? Instead of seeing the unknown as something to fear, what if we saw it as an adventure? Instead of needing to have all the answers, what if we became curious about the unfolding of life itself? Think about your own life. How much energy do you spend trying to predict the future? How often do you hesitate, waiting for certainty before taking action? And what would happen if, just for a moment, you let go of that need? What if you trusted that even though you don't know what's coming next, you can handle whatever arises? That you don't need to have the whole map, you just need to take the next step. Watts reminds us that the universe itself is a process of continuous change. Stars are born and die. Rivers carve mountains. Forests grow and decay. Nothing is static. And yet, we as humans try to make life something fixed and unchanging. But life is not a fixed thing. It is movement. It is flow. And the more we try to hold on to something that is constantly shifting, the more we suffer. But when we let go, when we allow ourselves to move with the rhythm of life, instead of against it, something extraordinary happens. We stop living in fear. We stop seeing uncertainty as a threat. We begin to trust. And in that trust, we find a kind of peace that no amount of control could ever give us. So let me ask you, what is one thing in your life right now that you are resisting? Maybe it's an unexpected change. Maybe it's an unknown future. Maybe it's a part of yourself that you are afraid to face. What would happen if, instead of fighting it, you softened into it? What if, instead of fearing the unknown, you welcomed it? In the final part, we are going to explore the most profound lesson of all, the illusion of separation. Because if life is a dance, if existence is a flow, then who exactly is doing the dancing? Who is the you that is experiencing this moment? And what if the answer to that question changes everything? The illusion of separation, discovering that you are the universe. What if I told you that the greatest illusion of all, the one that causes most of your suffering, your fears, your loneliness, is the belief that you are separate, that you are a small, isolated being moving through a world that is external to you? Alan Watts spent much of his life trying to help people wake up from this illusion, to see through the false boundary between self and other, between you and the universe. Because in reality, there is no separation. You are not in the universe. You are the universe, experiencing itself from a particular point of view. But most of us don't feel this way. We feel like we are trapped inside our own minds, looking out at the world as though it was something separate from us. We say things like, "I was born into this world," as if we arrived here as outsiders. But Watts challenges this idea. He reminds us that we did not come into this world, we grew out of it, just as a tree grows out of the earth. You are not separate from nature any more than a wave is separate from the ocean. The wave may appear to have its own distinct shape, its own movement, but it is still made entirely of the ocean itself. And so are you. Think about it. Every atom in your body once belonged to something else. The air you are breathing right now was once inside the lungs of countless other beings. The water in your cells has traveled through rivers, clouds, and oceans for billions of years. The very elements that form your body were forged in the heart of ancient stars. When you truly see this, you realize that the boundary between you and everything else is just a mental construct, a useful idea for navigating the world, but not the ultimate truth. And when you drop this illusion, something profound happens. You stop feeling so alone. You stop seeing life as something happening to you, and instead, you start to recognize that you are life itself. The same force that moves the stars, that turns the seasons, that grows forests and shapes mountains, that same force is flowing through you. You are not a stranger here. You belong. You always have. But this realization is not just philosophical, it has real, tangible effects on how you live. Because when you stop seeing yourself as separate, you also stop seeing others as separate. You begin to recognize yourself in everyone and everything. The stranger on the street is not just another person, they are another expression of the same life that flows through you. The trees, the rivers, the animals, the vast sky above, all of it is an extension of you. And when you truly understand this, compassion becomes effortless. Love becomes natural. Because harming another starts to feel like harming yourself. Now, let's pause for a moment. Think about the struggles in your life. How many of them come from feeling disconnected? From feeling like you are fighting against the world rather than moving with it? What would happen if, just for a moment, you let go of the idea that you are separate? If you saw yourself not as a small, fragile being trying to survive, but as a vast, interconnected part of something infinite and alive. Watts believed that this realization was the key to true freedom. Because once you see through the illusion of separation, fear begins to dissolve. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, even fear of death, all of these are based on the belief that you are a lone individual struggling against the forces of life. But when you recognize that you are life, that there is no real separation between you and everything else, then what is there to fear? A wave does not fear crashing back into the ocean because it was never separate to begin with. And neither are you. So the question is, can you allow yourself to trust this? Can you let go of the need to grasp, to control, to define yourself as something separate, and instead surrender to the flow of existence itself? Because when you do, something incredible happens. Life stops feeling like something you have to figure out. It stops feeling like something you have to fight against. It becomes, instead, what it was always meant to be: a dance, a play, a great unfolding. And in that realization, you find the deepest peace of all. Because you were never lost. You were never separate. You were always home.